The desert had its own way of keeping secrets. It swallowed the careless, the desperate, and the unlucky without a whisper, leaving behind nothing but wind, bones, and silence. On the far edge of the Llano Estacado, where the horizon stretched so far it could break a soul in half, a woman named Eleanor Briggs rode her mare along a forgotten trail. She was alone, as she had been for years, carrying only a rifle, a rope, and the quiet defiance of someone who had survived too much loss to ever again expect kindness from the world. The sun bore down with a merciless weight. Her canteen rattled half empty, and her shadow clung thinly beneath her horse's hooves. Then, through that suffocating stillness, something broke. A sound. At first it was faint, a muffled cry that seemed more like the call of a coyote tangled in brush. She reined in her horse, ears straining. Again the sound carried, a voice. Young, desperate, human, her instinct was to turn away. Trouble out here was more likely to end in a grave than in gratitude. But the sound kept pulling her, a raw, frantic plea carried on the wind. Eleanor dismounted, tethered her mare, and walked toward a dry creek bed where the soil looked soft and strange, darker than the earth around it. That was when she saw him. A boy, no more than 17, chest deep in quicksand, thrashing and sinking deeper with every violent move. His hair was black as a raven's wing, his skin copper under the sun, his eyes burning with the fire of someone who refused to die quietly. He wore fringed buckskin, torn and filthy from his struggle, and around his neck hung a leather cord with beads that caught the light like drops of blood. Eleanor froze. Her pulse hammered. She knew who he was, not his name, not his story, but his people, Comanche. The very word tightened her gut. They were raiders, riders of terror. The nightmare whispered across every frontier settlement. To help him was to invite death. To walk away was to let him vanish into the earth. For a long breath she stood there, torn between survival and mercy. The boy's eyes met hers. Even in the panic of drowning earth, they carried defiance. Not begging, not pleading, daring her to choose. Eleanor dropped her pack, yanked the coil of rope free, and cursed under her breath. "Damn fool," she muttered. Not sure if she meant him or herself. She looped the rope around a dried mesquite trunk and tossed the other end toward him. The first throw fell short. The boy growled, teeth bared as the muck dragged him lower. She tried again. This time it landed across his chest. He seized it with mud-slick hands, his strength fading, his face straining just above the choking mire. Eleanor braced her boots against the cracked ground and hauled with every muscle she had left. The rope cut into her palms, skin tearing, but she pulled as if she were dragging her own soul from hell. Inch by inch the earth tried to keep him. Inch by inch she refused to let it. His breathing turned ragged, a guttural rasp, his arms trembling with the weight of his body. "Hold, damn you!" she shouted, sweat blinding her eyes. At last, with a sound like the earth itself groaning in protest, the boy broke free, collapsing onto solid ground. His body was coated in mud, trembling, barely alive. He lay on his back, staring up at the sun with an expression that was not gratitude, but fury at the world for almost taking him. Eleanor knelt beside him, panting. She had expected fear in his eyes, maybe hatred. Instead, he turned his head and studied her as though she were some strange vision, something between an enemy and a ghost. His lips moved. He spoke a word in Comanche, harsh and sharp, foreign to her ears. She couldn't understand, but the sound lingered, a promise or a warning. Then his eyes fluttered shut. The desert wind swept across them both, carrying silence once more. Only now Eleanor knew that silence was not empty. It had weight, like the calm before a storm, and deep down, she feared she had just unleashed something far greater than a boy from the grip of the earth. If you love dark, gripping tales from the Wild West, hit subscribe and join us for more stories where every choice could mean life or death. The boy did not die that day. Eleanor dragged him back to her horse, mud drying like cracked armor across his skin. His breathing was shallow, uneven, but steady enough to cling to life. She thought about leaving him there, letting the vultures and coyotes finish what the quicksand had started. But she couldn't. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was pity. Perhaps, deep down, she was tired of watching things die without raising a hand to stop it. By the time she reached her cabin, twilight had turned the sky the color of blood bruised into the clouds. She heaved him onto the floorboards, his weight awkward, his body limp. Her cabin was nothing more than a box of timber, 4 walls that leaned against one another like tired men, but it was shelter. She lit a lantern, its glow throwing long shadows across the room. He stirred when she cut away the mud-caked buckskin from his chest, revealing angry welts where the earth had clawed at him. His eyes opened, wild and distrustful. She offered him water, tilting the canteen to his lips. He drank greedily, then coughed, the sound rattling deep in his chest. "Easy," she said, though she doubted he understood a word. For hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness while Eleanor tended to him. She ground willow bark for the pain, cleaned his cuts, wrapped him in a spare blanket. Each time his eyes opened, they burned into hers with the same question. Why? Why would she help him when the history between their people was written in raids, scalps, and graves? She didn't have an answer, not one that would matter to him. The night stretched long. Coyotes yipped beyond the mesquite line. The lantern flickered low. Eleanor sat with her rifle across her knees, listening to his breathing. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Trust was a fragile thing out here, and mercy was often repaid with a knife in the dark. At dawn, the boy was gone. Eleanor rose from her chair to find the blanket empty. The door left ajar, footprints pressed into the dust outside. He had taken nothing. Not her food, not her water, not even her horse. Just his life back, as if borrowed, and returned to where it belonged. She stood in the doorway, staring at the horizon until her eyes blurred. He had vanished into the desert like a ghost, leaving her with silence and questions. That silence followed her all day. It crept into the chores, into the sound of the pump, into the rhythm of the axe striking wood. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. By the second night, she noticed it. At first, she thought it was nothing, the creak of her cabin settling, the groan of wind against the shutters. But then she saw them, faint tracks in the dirt, circling her homestead, hoof prints, bare feet. More than one, her hand went to the rifle. She stepped outside, moonlight washing the land in silver. The prairie was empty, but she knew better. She could feel eyes on her, watching, waiting. Eleanor slept little. Each time she dozed, the crackle of brush or the snap of a twig pulled her awake. She scanned the horizon, saw nothing but shadows, and yet the feeling never left her. She was no longer alone. On the third day, the silence grew so loud it pressed against her chest. Birds did not sing, even the coyotes were gone. The land had turned to stillness, as if it too was waiting for something to arrive. Eleanor stood on her porch at dusk, her rifle in hand, watching the sun sink into the plains. She told herself she was ready for whatever came, but deep down she knew the truth. The boy she had pulled from the earth had not left her life. He had only gone to fetch it. The third night fell heavier than the others. The moon rose fat and pale, casting the plains in a strange half-light, as if the land were holding back its own breath. Eleanor Briggs sat on her porch, Winchester across her lap, her mare restless in the paddock. The animal stamped the ground, ears twitching, nostrils flaring as though it smelled something she could not see. That was when the first tremor reached her. At first, she thought it was the wind. But the ground quivered beneath her boots, faint but steady. A distant thunder rolling closer, closer, until it crawled up her bones. Her horse screamed, reared, then bolted against the fence. Eleanor rose slowly, heart hammering, the rifle heavy in her grip, and then she saw them. Across the far ridge, shadows moved. Not one, not 10, dozens, riders. Their silhouettes lined against the horizon like black flames. Spears caught the moonlight, feathers trailed in the wind, and the steady beat of hooves became a war drum rolling toward her, the Comanche. They came swift, a river of horseflesh and steel pouring into the valley, surrounding her cabin in a single breath. Dust rose, choking the air, and the thunder of hooves swallowed every thought but one. This is how I die. Eleanor lifted her rifle. She knew she couldn't stop them, couldn't even slow them, but she would not kneel, not beg. If this was her end, she would meet it standing. The riders drew close, encircling her porch in a wide ring. Painted faces glared from beneath eagle feathers. Arrows glimmered, lances lowered. One warrior spat into the dirt, another muttered words that carried like curses, and then the circle parted. A single rider broke forward. His hair was braided with bone and silver, his shoulders draped in a buffalo hide. His face was stern, carved with lines of both age and war. His horse snorted, pawing at the earth. This was no scout, no ordinary warrior. This was their chief. He halted a few paces from her porch. His eyes found hers, sharp as obsidian, carrying the weight of 1,000 buried dead. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Every story she'd ever heard of Comanche vengeance rose like smoke in her mind. Scalps taken, cabins burned, settlers erased from the earth as if they had never lived, and then she saw him. The boy, alive, whole, mounted on a painted pony beside the chief. He looked stronger than when she had last seen him, the mud and weakness gone, replaced by defiance. He pointed toward her cabin, words spilling from his mouth in a torrent of Comanche syllables. His father listened, eyes never leaving Eleanor. The ring of warriors tightened. Eleanor heard the creak of bowstrings, the click of rifles being cocked. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The boy's voice rose, sharp and insistent, his hands gesturing with urgency. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was speaking for her. The chief dismounted slowly, the ground seeming to tremble under his steps. He walked to the porch, each stride deliberate, until he stood a single yard from Eleanor. His presence filled the air, pressing down on her chest like the weight of the desert sky. The boy fell silent. The world held its breath. The chief raised his hand, palm outward, not in peace, not in threat, something between. Then in a voice deep as the earth itself he spoke. Words in Comanche, rolling like thunder she could not translate. She didn't move, didn't blink. The chief studied her face as if searching for something beneath her skin. Courage, weakness, guilt. Then, without a word of English, he turned and barked a command. The warriors pulled back, their circle widening, though their eyes still burned holes through her. Eleanor lowered her rifle, but her hands did not stop trembling. The boy slid from his pony, walked past his father and placed a hand on the wooden post of her porch. His eyes found hers once more, and though she still could not understand his language, she understood his meaning. This is not over. The tribe did not ride away. They stayed. Warriors dismounted, tethered their horses, and began to make camp on the very edge of her land, fires sparking to life under the night sky. The valley filled with their voices, with the rhythm of drums, with the smoke of cooking fires. The smell of roasted meat drifted on the air, mingling with the fear in her chest. Eleanor stood on her porch, watching as her world was consumed. She had saved a boy from quicksand, and in return his entire people had come. The days that followed were unlike anything Eleanor Briggs had ever endured. Her homestead, once defined by silence, had become a living camp. The Comanche did not vanish back into the plains. They rooted themselves into her world as if they belonged there, as if the valley and the creek and even the soil beneath her cabin were theirs to claim. Fires burned in a half-circle around the edges of her land. Smoke twisted upward in gray threads, carrying the smell of buffalo fat, roasted venison, and pungent herbs. Horses grazed on her grass, pawing the earth where she once planted corn. Eleanor never set down her rifle. From dawn until dusk, she felt their eyes on her. Warriors sat cross-legged in the dirt, sharpening blades that caught the sun in white flashes. Women pounded cornmeal in wooden mortars, their rhythm steady, like a drumbeat that echoed inside her skull. Children ran wild, their laughter shrill, their feet scattering dust through the air. The boy she had saved moved among them, no longer weak, no longer broken. His name, she learned by listening, was Tahuya. She heard it shouted by his peers, heard it spoken with pride by his father, the chief. His presence commanded respect, yet when his gaze found her, something sharper lingered there, a thread of connection neither of them could cut. On the first morning, the chief himself came to her porch. He did not knock. He did not wait for permission. He simply stood there, tall as a tree, arms folded across his chest, and spoke in Comanche. His voice was low, measured, unhurried. Eleanor could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. A decree, not a request. She answered with silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face was stone. After he left, she found a bundle on her doorstep. Strips of dried meat, a pouch of herbs, and a water skin filled to the brim. It was an offering, or a warning. She could not decide which. That night she did not cook. She ate their food, chewing slowly, tasting smoke and bitterness. Each swallow felt like a bargain she had not chosen to make. The second day tested her resolve further. She awoke to the sound of hooves pounding close, too close. Bursting out with her rifle raised, she found 3 Comanche boys chasing her mare, who screamed in terror, foam lacing her mouth as they drove her in circles. Eleanor shouted, her voice ragged with fury. The boys only laughed, their teeth flashing white, until a sharp bark from across the camp stopped them cold. It was Tahuya. He strode forward, his face carved with anger, and smacked one of the boys across the head. Words flew from his mouth like arrows, cutting them down until their laughter died into shame. They scattered. Her mare, trembling and wild-eyed, bolted back to the fence. Eleanor stood frozen, the rifle clutched so hard her hands ached. Tahuya turned to her, their eyes locked. He did not smile, did not soften. He simply nodded once, a soldier acknowledging another before walking away. It was then she realized. He did not see her as a savior. He saw her as a participant in something larger, something that had not yet revealed its shape. By the third day, the rhythm of coexistence settled into her bones like an unwelcome song. She chopped wood under the weight of their eyes. She fetched water while Comanche women watched in silence, their faces unreadable. At night, she lay on her narrow bed, listening to the pulse of drums drifting through the valley, to chants that rose and fell like waves against her cabin walls. Sleep came only in snatches, broken by dreams of quicksand and shadows on horseback, and yet cracks began to form in her fear. A child wandered too close to her porch one afternoon. A girl no older than 6, her hair braided, her eyes wide as the sky. She carried a carved wooden horse in her hand. For a long moment, the two of them stared at each other across the distance. Then, without a word, the girl placed the toy on the bottom step and ran back to the safety of her people. Eleanor bent down, picked it up. The horse was crude, the wood chipped, but its form was unmistakable. She turned it over in her hand until she realized her throat was tight, her breath shaky. Later that evening, an elder woman, gray-haired, bent, her face a map of 100 winters, appeared at her door. She offered Eleanor a bundle of leaves and roots, speaking in a tongue Eleanor could not follow. When Eleanor hesitated, the woman pressed the herbs into her hands with surprising strength, her eyes fierce, insistent. It was medicine, a gift, a gesture she could not ignore. Each of these moments chipped away at the wall between them, though Eleanor fought against it. For every kindness, there was still a glance that promised violence. For every gesture of peace, the memory of raids and burned-out homes whispered at the back of her mind. The Comanche had not attacked, but they had not left. They were waiting. For what, she did not yet know. On the 5th night, the chief came again. This time he brought Tahuya. The boy spoke, his words sharp, his hands gesturing toward her, toward the land, toward the stars above. The chief listened in silence, then turned his eyes on Eleanor, and for the first time, he spoke a word in English. Debt. The sound of it was heavy, like a stone dropped in still water. Eleanor felt it ripple through her, through the night itself. A debt had been created. She had pulled his son from the earth, but such an act was not free. It was not forgotten. In their world, everything carried a price. The chief left her with that word, walking back into the circle of firelight, leaving Eleanor trembling in its echo. Sleep would not come. She sat by her lantern, staring at the wooden horse left on her step, at the bundle of herbs on her table, at the rifle across her knees. Out there, the Comanche sang songs that reached into the marrow of the night. Songs of blood, songs of memory, songs of debts that could never be erased. Eleanor closed her eyes and knew. The storm had not passed. It was only gathering strength. The sun rose blood-red over the plains, a warning, a promise. Eleanor Briggs stood on her porch, rifle in hand, the wind cutting across her face like a whip. The Comanche camped around her homestead stirred with the dawn, warriors mounting their horses, children whispering, elders watching in silence. The boy she had saved, Tahuya, sat astride a painted pony, his eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk seeking prey. She had thought the storm was the tribe's arrival. She had been wrong. Across the far ridge, dust spiraled into the air, and the unmistakable rhythm of hooves approached. Cowboys, armed and merciless, with blood in their eyes and the promise of destruction. They were rivals of hers, men who had long plotted against her land, her survival. The frontier was lawless, and they meant to claim it by fire and steel. Eleanor's breath caught. There was no time to flee. Her cabin was small. Her supplies were meager. But behind her, the Comanche warriors, Tahuya at their center, waited for her command, or perhaps waited to see if she would survive this test. She raised her rifle. Her voice was steady, though her heart thundered. "Stay behind me," she said. To no one but the wind. Yet somehow the tribe understood. The cowboys surged forward like a dark wave, rifles gleaming, voices shouting. Dust roared around them, the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and earth mixing into a storm that made Eleanor's eyes water. Then, without hesitation, the Comanche rode out. It was a symphony of chaos. Arrows arced across the sky, finding gaps in coats and chests. Rifles barked from both sides. Horses screamed as riders collided in a whirlwind of fury. Eleanor fired from her porch, her aim precise, her nerves steeled by every year of solitude and every lesson learned in survival. Tahuya led the charge, his bow singing death through the morning air. The chief rode beside him, commanding with authority, unflinching, unstoppable. Eleanor realized then that she was no longer alone. She was part of something larger, a bond forged in quicksand, in fear, in survival. Hours passed like minutes. Dust coated every surface, mingling with blood, sweat, and the cries of men and horses alike. Eleanor ducked as a rifle cracked near her head, the shot splintering a fence post beside her. She fired, felt the recoil, and then surged forward with a small group of warriors to flank the attackers. By midday, the cowboys faltered. Some fled, the rest captured by the discipline and unity of the Comanche and Eleanor's unexpected courage. The plains were silent again, but not the same silence that had haunted her before. This was earned, heavy with tension and relief. The chief approached her once more, dust clinging to his buffalo hide, eyes solemn. Tahuya rode up, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, his gaze steady and knowing. The chief spoke, in Comanche, softly, slowly. Eleanor didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Respect, gratitude, a promise of protection. The tribe encircled her cabin once more. Not as intruders, not as strangers, but as allies, a bond sealed in blood and honor. Eleanor lowered her rifle, feeling the weight of the frontier lift slightly from her shoulders. The battle had ended, yet, as she watched the sun begin its descent over the plains, she knew the Wild West would always demand vigilance, courage, and the willingness to make impossible choices. She had saved a boy. She had faced death. And in doing so, she had earned a place not just in survival, but in a legacy larger than herself. Eleanor Briggs turned to the horizon, wind in her hair, eyes hardened, but heart alive. The Comanche tribe, once strangers, now stood beside her. And together, they faced the endless, unforgiving frontier, ready for whatever came next. The desert whispered around them, quiet, but not empty. She had chosen trust over fear, mercy over ignorance, and in that choice she had discovered a new kind of strength, a strength that could survive the Wild West, and whatever storms the world might send next.